All right, let's talk about the next section, chapters 19, section 3, the social impact of the Industrial Revolution. Our objectives for this section: explain what caused urbanization and what life was like in these new industrial cities. Not always good. Compare and contrast the industrial working class with the new middle class. Certainly differences in resources, differences in lifestyle. Understand how this new factory system worked and how the mine system worked and how it changed the way people work in their daily lives. They're very different from the agricultural focus that we've seen to this point. In the end, we'll consider the benefits and the challenges of industrialization. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or is the answer somewhere in between? Our focus question: what were the social effects of the Industrial Revolution? In the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people made a lot of money, and we'll talk about some of those, both in Europe as well as in the United States. However, most of the people that fueled the Industrial Revolution, that being the workers, lived a pretty horrific life. Poverty, poor living conditions, poor working conditions. Over time, however, one could argue that the standards of living increased for most of the population, the middle and even the lower class. And in the end, society did benefit from industrialization. But as we mentioned, until that point, conditions were pretty terrible: dangerous, unsanitary, overcrowded, and poverty that was very difficult, if not impossible, for families and people to escape. As we've talked about this, the Industrial Revolution changes brought about rapid urbanization, and urbanization is going to be a movement of people from the country to the city. Changes in farming, which we talked about in previous sections. Population increase, both in England, in Europe, and in the world. The enclosure movement, driving people off of farms. And in the cities, the need for workers resulted in people migrating to the cities. Practically overnight, towns and cities that had been small, especially if they're near coal mines or other mines, mushroomed and the populations grew dramatically. The city of Manchester, which we've talked about in a few different instances, both in canals as well as in the railroads, grew from 17,000 people in the 1750s to over 70,000 just 50 years later. Population growth and the change in the way industry operated resulted in distribution changes for two key resources: people and labor. And you can see from the chart just the population growth in London from just under 500,000 in 1750. By the time we get to 1850, we're almost at 3 million, and then from that point it gets much more steep, up to almost 7 million by 1900. The Industrial Revolution created a new class of people. Now, we've talked about the rise of the middle class, even coming out of the Middle Ages, but this is much more extensive. So the new middle class, and using the French word that we talked about in the last unit, the bourgeoisie. And it's this middle class really that benefited the most from the Industrial Revolution, and they come from a variety of backgrounds. These people might include merchants, inventors, investors who are putting their money into the market as entrepreneurs, and there certainly were a few of rags to riches individuals who were able to tell the story of pulling themselves up and getting ahead based on hard work. The middle class, again, enjoying a lot of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. Clean neighborhoods, running water, which certainly didn't happen in the poorer neighborhoods, paved streets. They were comfortable enough in their household income that the women were able to stay home and raise their children. The women did not need to go into the workforce. This certainly was not the case for the working class. Where the working class lived, it was crowded, it was dark, it was dirty, often smoky from the soot and other pollutants coming out of the factories. The working poor lived in tenements, usually multiple level buildings like the one you see here, usually dirty, many packed into a crowded room. Garbage would have been all over the place, as you can even see here. Sanitation was certainly not available. Garbage would just be thrown over the back of the balcony. No place for sewage, often just dumped directly into the river, which certainly made it very susceptible to the spread of disease, contaminating the drinking water and other water that was used for cooking. So a very difficult situation for the working class. And if a worker wanted to try to improve his situation in the workplace, generally was powerless to do so. Labor unions were illegal, so employees could not get together and try to impact some change or force some change upon the employer. Sometimes workers would try to get together and organize in secret, but they didn't have any political voice, so they couldn't affect or change the laws. And oftentimes they were found out and they were summarily fired or mistreated in other ways, usually with violence. This frustration, this powerlessness, oftentimes led to violence. And in the 1800s, we saw textile workers rioting against working conditions, looking for an improvement in their situation. There was also a small group that was against these labor-saving machines that they saw as replacing their jobs and replacing workers. This group's called the Luddites, and they would smash these machines. And sometimes in modern days, you'll hear the word Luddite used to describe someone who might be anti-technology. Now, a lot of workers found comfort from their extremely difficult life in the cities and in the factories, looking to religion. And one of the religions that came into being during this time period was Methodism. Now, we're still in Great Britain, and Methodism was founded by John Wesley in the mid-1700s. And he emphasized improving oneself by staying sober and adopting a moral code, moral ways and moral actions. In the hymns and the sermons of their meetings, they offered salvation in the next life and forgiveness, trying to offer some level of hope for those that were living in these trying times. The idea was, and the important takeaway is, channeling this anger and this frustration with their current life into efforts to reform as opposed to efforts to violently cause revolution. Now, in this new industrial society, the heart of these new cities was the factory. And we talked about this being the beginning of the factory, where people would no longer necessarily work in their home, but they would congregate in this new location, that being the factory. The technology used in this machine age and this rapid pace of change was very difficult. And new workers found it very difficult to adapt to this new way of life in this new environment. Oftentimes factory workers lived and worked in very unpleasant conditions. And let's compare what it used to be like to what it was like then in the industrial age. So think back to in a very agricultural environment. Certainly people worked hard in their villages, but they worked depending on the season. You know, it might be planting season, it might be harvest season, there might be seasons where there wasn't as much to do, but they controlled the pace of their work. They had some freedom while working hard, but they controlled it. In a factory setting, the schedule is much more rigid and the employee does not have control. Shifts would last anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day. Very little time for breaks, including for meals. So fatigue and hunger certainly would have been issues. Oftentimes they worked 6 and some even 7 days a week without much time off to recover. Oftentimes, especially with lack of safeguards on heavy machinery, workers would be hurt by these machines. Their clothing might get caught and they might be pulled into a gear or something like that. They were breathing in dust and lint if it was a textile factory. As a matter of fact, if you'll look on this picture here on the left, you do see this must have been later in the industrial period. You'll see some guards on these gears, but in the beginning those guards would not have been in place, and with the type of clothing that would have been worn, it might have been dangerous if someone wasn't paying attention to get caught up in that machinery. A lot of the early factory workers were women. Again, initially in the textile industries, but certainly in others as we went forward. But there are some reasons why women were most of the workers in the factories. Women were able to be paid half of what men earned. Certainly not something that we would necessarily want to accept today, but they were willing to work and they could be paid much less than a man would be paid. Again, some of these views of women aren't necessarily historically accurate today, but this is the perception at the time. They were considered easier to manage, less likely to resist instruction, to resist direction. It was believed that in this factory setting, in this very rigid setting, that women would be better able to adapt to the structure than men. And this was doubly difficult for women because after working a full day in the factory, 12 plus hours, oftentimes they had to go home and take care of their family, especially if they had children or multiple children in these horrific conditions in the home, in the tenements. So doubly difficult for women during this time period. Working conditions in the mine were even worse than in the factories. Miners might have a higher wage than factory workers, but their conditions were certainly much more dangerous. Coal dust filled workers' lungs, and black lung would be the cause of death for many of these mine workers. Explosions were an issue, cave-ins and floods. We didn't have many, at all, safety protections that we might have in a coal mine today, and even in modern times, coal mining is a dangerous profession. Plus they worked long hours, 12, 16 hours a day, oftentimes in darkness. Child labor was also an accepted practice in the workforce at this time. Most children started working at age 7 or 8, so you can imagine if you have a younger sister or brother who might be this age, how successful they might be in a factory environment. But oftentimes this happened and they were paid very little for this work. And think about it, the families needed the money. In textile factories, small fingers, small hands, quick reactions. They were able to crawl between machines and repair or change spools of thread. So very adept at working in the factories. Like the adults, they worked in dust and lint-filled rooms, so they were breathing this in at a very young age. And children even worked in the mines. Long hours, often doing very hard labor, pushing carts, swinging an axe, certainly not getting proper food, proper care, proper rest, and education. We did see after the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution some action taken to improve the condition for children who were working in the factories. The factory laws, passed in the early 1800s, graciously limited or reduced the work days for children to 12 hours a day. Children under 8 were not allowed to work in the cotton mills. And then some more reforms a little bit later in the 30s and 40s, reducing hours further for children, but also covering women at this point as well. Inspectors are sent into the factories to make sure that conditions are safer, and in some cases that there be education, or basic education, offered to these child workers. So since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, both in England and Europe and in the United States, there's been this debate as to whether industrialization was a blessing or a curse. And certainly there's two sides to the issue. As we've talked about, the plight of the worker, great hardship for those working in the factories, working in the mines. Pay was considerably low. Conditions were awful, oftentimes dangerous, and their life outside of their work was pretty dismal because they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the protection, they didn't have the facilities that would make life comfortable. As time goes on and the Industrial Revolution develops, workers do gain some political say and some political power. Wages come up over time as the power of labor increases. The cost of new products that are provided to this increasing population drops. We have new products that come into play as well, and the cost of travel drops. So you've got certainly negatives, especially in the beginning. Over time you start to see some positives, some benefits from the Industrial Revolution, but certainly something that could be debated even in modern times. Okay, just a few terms from this section. Urbanization, the movement of people to the cities, primarily driven by the enclosure movement and other actions taken in agriculture to be more efficient, farming larger plots, drive people, this increasing population, into the cities. Tenement. The crowded multi-story buildings divided into separate apartments, oftentimes with many people living in a tiny apartment, and this is where the factory workers and their families would live. Pretty terrible conditions. Labor union. A workers' organization. Generally, early in the Industrial Revolution, labor unions were considered illegal. You weren't allowed to form one. You weren't allowed to join together to lobby for better conditions, for better wages, for more safety protections. As time goes on, we'll see the rise in the power of the labor unions, but early on, not much power.